Well, joining us for more on this is Chris Hattingh. He's the Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis, CRA, in South Africa. Thank you so much for your time on the program.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity. It should be a very easy discussion to try and make sense of what's going to happen in Washington.
Indeed, in a few moments from now, we should be seeing, pictures of that meeting even after it happens. But how do you envisage, this meeting would go? What do you expect from this, the two leaders sitting down, speaking together?
So this might be a little bit reductionist, but I think it could go one of two ways. So the good scenario and then the bad scenario. The good scenario is that most of the discussion, the luncheon, the media engagement, all of that is focused more on trade and investment matters. The bad scenario, the worst case scenario, is that the focus is on things like the quote unquote refugee issue, that it's on expropriation and property rights, that it's on the case that South Africa brought against Israel at the ICJ, that it's more of those populist, emotive notions that President Trump and some of his colleagues have focused on. It's very interesting that the delegations are as big as they are, and on the US side, you've got serious sort of heft in the room, not least of which, of course, Elon Musk and various other government representatives. It's interesting that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, isn't reported to be part of the US delegation. But then, of course, on the South African side, you have the government representatives and a few business people and some South African golfers, showing perhaps that South Africa realizes they need to engage in some unconventional diplomacy to get a real purchase with President Trump.
Indeed, and you've given a long list of issues. There's the land expropriation issue, there's the ICJ case, the refugee asylum, there's the trade tariffs. That long list. But what do you think should be the priority for President Ramaphosa during this meeting?
So we just had this afternoon the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, deliver his third budget in 2025. It looks like everything will be smooth sailing and pass. The president, where possible, he and his colleagues should build on that positive fiscal momentum. It sends a good signal to international markets, to investors looking at South Africa, that the GNU has now put together a budget. Of course, there are various pieces of legislation that need to be passed in Parliament, but it's a good start. So for the president and his delegation to build on that, focusing on growth and investments, looking at critical minerals, how important those are for South Africa and for the US, and looking at where there could be additional South African investments in the US and additional American investments in South Africa to ensure more job creation. South Africa comes into this meeting in the context of a low growth economy. Between 2012 and 2023, South African GDP averaged only 0.8% growth per year. We need as many sources of investment as possible, domestic and, of course, foreign. The US, given that it is South Africa's second most important export market from an agricultural, from a critical minerals, from an automotive point of view, those benefits and relationships need to be retained and built on wherever possible and indeed expanded. So I think if the president can focus matters on investment, job creation, and trade, that would be a highly successful visit. And also, just given the sort of heightened rhetoric that there has been from the Trump administration, the fact that the meeting in and of itself is taking place, I think, is a good sign that you wouldn't have expected given the rhetoric. So let's see if South Africa can use the foot in the door that it has today.
Yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. After the meeting, I think we'll be calling you back to review all that has played out. But just before I let you go, looking ahead, what are your predictions, for the future trajectory of the US-South Africa relations?
I'll try and answer that by almost answering the question in a roundabout way. I think for many countries, especially in Africa, they're going to have to deal with a much more transactional administration in the US for the time of President Trump's second administration. He doesn't generally like wide trade agreements between the US and sort of blocks. He wants country to country investments and engagements, trade agreements, maybe on a bilateral level too. So for South Africa, for other African countries that are looking to grow, especially in this year, so countries such as Nigeria, Rwanda, Kenya, with such potential, they need to figure out what can they bring to the table and what should the US bring to the table if the US government and US companies want to invest in countries like South Africa and countries on the rest of the continent. I think South Africa has benefited from 1994 from having a bit of a moral superpower status, given the first government by former President Nelson Mandela coming out of apartheid. A lot of that has now been sort of is now at an end in its engagements with the US. It needs to be very hard-nosed, engage on terms that favor economic growth and investment. That will benefit South Africa in the long term with the Trump administration, but also build up its investment appeal around the rest of the world. I don't think it should focus exclusively on just giving everything for the sake of optics to the Americans. They need to find out where are there areas of overlap and possible growth and investment agreements, and then parlay those to other agreements with other countries and regions as well.
Thank you so much, Chris Hattingh, Executive Director of the Center for Risk Analysis in Johannesburg. Thank you.